I'm Margi Hope, and welcome to America Connected. We're a nonprofit all about cultural diplomacy, bringing people of the world closer together. Today's episode is so amazing. We're going to extend the episode as we are honored with a special guest, Dr. John Lenczowski from the Institute of World Politics, who discusses the special underground elevators, secret compartments, and the famous trust case, and so much more. Dr. John Lenczowski will discuss the Reagan intelligence policies concerning disinformation, other active measures, and strategic deception. He is the founder and president emeritus and chancellor of the Institute of World Politics, which is the only academic institution dedicated to teaching all the arts of statecraft. Dr. Lenczowski served in the State Department in the Bureau of Education Affairs and as special advisor to the Undersecretary for Political Affairs. He was also director of European and Soviet Affairs at the National Security Council. Additionally, he served as principal Soviet Affairs advisor to President Reagan. Educated at the University of California, Berkeley, and he received his master's and PhD from the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. He is the author of Full Spectrum Diplomacy and Grand Strategy. Cultural Diplomacy, a multifaceted strategic asset of Soviet power. The sources of Soviet perestroika and Soviet perception of the U.S. foreign policy. It is my proud pleasure to introduce and welcome Dr. John Lenczowski. Hi, John. It's great to see you. Thank you for speaking with us today. Can you talk to us about strategic deception?
Well, thank you, Margie. It's great to be with you, and I am delighted to have an association on the advisory board of America Connected, and I think that what you're doing in cultural diplomacy is a wonderful contribution to America's overall public diplomacy effort. And so I congratulate you for your entrepreneurial initiative in all of this. We need a lot of help in this field. Cultural diplomacy is one of those ways of connecting with people abroad so that we lubricate international relations, so that we soften people's hearts a little bit so that they're more willing to listen to us and negotiate with us, do business with us, and so on. So thank you for doing what you're doing. It's good for America. It's good for the world. Let me start with, since you've mentioned the larger topic of strategic deception, this is an art which is central to the efforts of our adversaries in their Cold War operations against us. 2,500 years ago, the ancient Chinese sage Sun Tzu, who is sometimes known as Sun Tzu, and there are different pronunciations, said that the essence of war is deception. And he said that to defeat your enemy without using violence, without using force, is the acme of skill. So how do you do that? Well, deception is one of those ways of doing it. And so this is, unfortunately, a subject which experts and aspiring experts in international relations in this country do not study unless they come to the Institute of World Politics. It has not proven to be a regular professional specialization and discipline within the U.S. intelligence community, and you would think that it would. It's critical. Unfortunately, a recent study was done by the CIA's, one of its longtime greatest experts on deception, and he came to the conclusion that the only time our intelligence community pays attention to deception on a systematic basis is when we happen to have a CIA director who is personally interested in the subject. And he says that of all the CIA directors in living memory, the only ones who were really serious about this were William J. Casey in the Reagan administration and Jim Woolsey in the Clinton administration. So this wasn't necessarily a partisan issue at all. So what is strategic deception? There are different kinds of deception. There's strategic and there's tactical. Tactical deception is where you deceive your adversary, for example, during wartime, about the weapons you may be possessing. For example, the Ukrainians have been doing this to the Russians lately. They have built wooden howitzers, artillery pieces that look just like the real ones, only they make them out of wood and they put them in different places. And then when the Russian drones come by and they see something that looks like a real howitzer, they launch their very expensive missiles and they destroy the wooden structure, but the real ones are hidden somewhere else and are thereby less vulnerable to the Russian assault. Now that is tactical deception. There are many other kinds of it. Strategic deception is where you try to deceive your adversary about your very nature and about your strategic intentions and purposes. The idea is, in most cases, to psychologically disarm your adversary when you do this deception, to make them feel as though you, the deceiver, are not really a threat, or a threat in certain ways, and that therefore the target of your deception can relax his guard and be both intellectually and physically unprepared to deal with you. So there is an analog to this in nature. There are, as I like to tell my students, there are carnivores and herbivores in the forest. And the carnivores eat the herbivores. And some of these carnivores, whether they be a certain kind of, it could be an insect, it could be, some kind of a fish. There are all kinds of creatures out there that eat other creatures. And some of them make it their business to disguise themselves and where they try to convey to their targets, the herbivores, that they are herbivores too, and that therefore the herbivores can let down their guard, be less vigilant, and be more vulnerable to being eaten by the carnivores. So this is a very simple thing, and this was something that the Soviet Union did big time during the Cold War. They wanted to convince us that they no longer had the global strategic objectives that we understood them to have when we believed that they were communists. And, if you're a communist, then by definition, you have global unlimited objectives. You seek what Marx called the world historical transformation of the world into a classless society, and that's why the global communist movement, for decades led by the Soviet Union using the instrument of the Communist International, which was known, its acronym was the Comintern, used this movement and the organization to try to help bring about communist takeovers in other countries. Well, if we can become convinced that they're not communists anymore, that they have changed, and that therefore, by definition, they no longer have unlimited objectives in the world, then it follows that since they now seem to have only limited objectives, perhaps those objectives can be accommodated. Perhaps we can appease them successfully in the interests of peace. And maybe we can give them a little bit of territory and then they'll stop being hungry. Maybe we can sign some agreements with them that they badly want. Whatever it may be. But the larger point is to convince us that they no longer seek the political transformation of the United States and the free world into communist regimes. So there were many such strategic deception themes. One of them, for example, was that there are hawks and doves in the Kremlin, and where the doves, as the Washington Post told us, Yuri Andropov, the longtime head of the KGB, was portrayed by the Post as a dove. He talked with dissidents. He liked jazz music. He liked to drink Scotch whiskey. He had modern art on the walls. He was a thoroughly moderate, non-ideological fellow who clearly must have had some kind of reform intentions. And he really wasn't like those mean old Stalinist hawks who were lurking in the background. And so the idea here is, we better make a deal, sign agreements with Andropov, because then, if we don't, it will weaken his position, and the mean old Stalinist, Marxist-Leninist hawks will take over, and then we'll be really in bad shape in our international relations. So there were many, many such themes, but the hawks and doves in the Kremlin was one of them. The Chinese have been particularly skilled at doing this, and where they persuaded just about everybody that they had ceased to be communist, that they had now adopted capitalism, and that these free market reforms that Deng Xiaoping had implemented would now be, the precursor of political reforms, where they would become more democratic. And so everybody wanted to go to do business with China, and we completely let down our guard. Meanwhile, and Deng Xiaoping had a little aphorism for this: hide your capabilities and bide your time. And now they have built up a massive military operation. Their navy is bigger than ours. They're probably ahead of us in the application of artificial intelligence to military purposes. They may be ahead of us in quantum computing, which is has enormous national security implications. And they've developed hypersonic missiles. And General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has said that their development of a hypersonic missile, and the Russians too, by the way, this is a Sputnik-like moment for the United States. The problem is, are we treating it as a Sputnik-like moment? No, because we have been successfully psychologically anesthetized. And where are all of the elder statesmen saying amens to what General Milley said? They're all indirectly on Beijing's payroll. I shouldn't say all, but many of them. They finish their government service, they go and work for a consulting firm, that opens doors in China to American corporations. The American corporations make some money doing business with China, and then the elder statesmen get paid. And you never hear those people say anything about a threat from communist China. So that's an example of how strategic deception is directly applicable to our current situation and our increasingly parlous national defense posture.
Tell us about other countries. Are they like us? What would you say?
Yes. So now, there are, one aspect of strategic deception is to encourage, deception is to encourage some of the, let's say, conceptual patterns with which we are, accustomed to pursuing. It is designed to exploit a desire to be deceived. It really works best when the target wants to be deceived. It also, one of the conceptual patterns that strategic deception exploits is mirror imaging. Mirror imaging is where you look at others as if they are just like you. And so constantly during the Cold War, we would hear people who had visited the Soviet Union, the Russians are just like us. They love their children just as much as we love ours. They put their pants on in the morning, one leg at a time. They like to have a nice cocktail, and they like to listen to, beautiful music. Yeah, they're just like us. And so this is an interesting thing because it relates very, very much to what you do in cultural diplomacy, Margie. The Soviets would exploit, and the Chinese did too, and still do, they exploit exchanges, which are an incredibly important part of cultural diplomacy. The problem is that when you do exchanges with totalitarian powers that have aggressive intentions in the international arena, it can have a strategically deceptive effect. So, for example, let's say you have an interparliamentary exchange between American Congress people and, let's say during the Soviet Union, members of the so-called Supreme Soviet, which was their quote-unquote parliament. Well, is this a real interparliamentary exchange? In fact, members of the Supreme Soviet were not elected representatives of the people. Because there were no free elections in the Soviet Union. The problem is that when you're dealing with a severely authoritarian or totalitarian regime like the Chinese regime today or North Korea, Iran is another one, which is not fully totalitarian, but it's severely authoritarian, and it has many of the hallmarks of a totalitarian system. People are not exactly like us. And, when I'm just to finish this point about the interparliamentary exchange, who were these people with whom our congressmen were having an exchange? They were Soviet propagandists disguised as Congress people, right, as elected representatives. And so let's say you have an exchange between the American Bar Association and what was then called the Association of Soviet Lawyers. Now, it seems to be a reciprocal exchange, where the Soviet lawyers seem to be a mirror image of our lawyers. But if you really want to have a reality check about this, these people may have been lawyers in a certain respect, but they were not independent advocates who would represent businesses, of which there were basically none in the Soviet Union. There were state enterprises, or individuals who were accused of crimes and so on and so forth. To do the reality check, imagine an exchange between the American Bar Association and the Association of Nazi Gestapo Prosecutors. Okay? Does that sound like a reciprocal exchange? No, it doesn't. And that's what we were doing. That's what the ABA was doing with the Association of Soviet Lawyers. So mirror imaging then can have its very dangerous effects. For example, we in the United States think that it is crazy and impossible to fight and win a nuclear war. And so we assume that everybody else thinks the same thing, that this is perfectly reasonable thinking. Well, the Soviets, and in my view, Putin's regime today, does not, they do not believe this. The Soviets would say about our attitude, you Americans, you're very sentimental about nuclear weapons. Why should you be? After all, you Americans killed more Japanese, more civilians in your firebombing of Tokyo than you killed in either Hiroshima or Nagasaki with nuclear weapons. It's just you did it more efficiently in Hiroshima. And so, what's the real difference? So they prepare themselves for the possibility that nuclear war might actually take place.
What about the underground system with elevators in the Soviet Union, the Special Transportation for Leadership?
As you mentioned at the very beginning of the program, they were developing a secret civil defense system. Now, our intelligence community did not want to believe this. And we started getting human reports from emigres and some defectors about how there was a deep underground system in Moscow and maybe some other places to exfiltrate the leadership of the party and of the major ministries in the case of nuclear war. And our intelligence people did not believe this. They thought, these are just a bunch of disgruntled emigres who have a chip on their shoulder and they're trying to dramatize things and they are not credible sources. Until we started getting technical intelligence that demonstrated that, yes, indeed, they were developing this deep underground system. And this consisted of special elevators in the major buildings that would bring people down to a parallel subway system that was not the famous Moscow subway system. It was a parallel system which would spirit the people out to special airports where the aircraft would then send them to special underground bunkers. Now, the mirror imagers will say, yeah, but we had our own underground bunkers, like over at the Greenbrier, the famous hotel on the West Virginia border, big, elegant resort hotel, and in the mountain there, they dug a deep underground bunker for members of Congress and the executive branch. Well, excuse me, it's not the mirror image of what was going on in the Soviet Union. I call your attention to a place called Yamantau Mountain. Yamantau Mountain is a mountain in the Urals, in the heart of Russia, that is designed to protect large numbers of people, house industry, as well as huge stores of food and water and so on. In the Ural Mountains in Russia. And there was a leak, an intelligence leak, that came out in the mid-late 90s, to my recollection, that nobody noticed, that revealed the existence of this, and not only that the Soviets had been building this, but that the post-Soviets were still building it. Now, how big is it? It is a collection of bunkers. It's not just one big cavern. It's a collection of bunkers, all in this mountain, that are approximately the size of the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area inside the Beltway. This is remarkable. Another example. There were senior Nazi officials, including the head of the Abwehr, the Nazi intelligence, and a couple of senior diplomats who were so fed up with Hitler and what he was doing that they approached the U.S. government with a plan to assassinate Hitler and to collaborate with the United States to prevent the Kremlin from taking over half of Europe or all of Europe. But there were Soviet agents of influence in the U.S. government who had persuaded the president to demand unconditional surrender of the Nazis. And these Nazis who wanted to get rid of Hitler could not accept unconditional surrender. And so the deal that they were offering ended up falling through. It ended up prolonging the war, because if we had accepted that deal, then they were in a much better position to assassinate Hitler than von Stauffenberg was subsequently. And so that war could have ended a lot sooner, and we could have prevented, with German cooperation, non-Nazi cooperation, we could have prevented the Soviet takeover of half of Europe. Then, excuse me, we would have saved a lot of lives. And then there is another analog. Soviet agents of influence in the Roosevelt administration were encouraging a policy of unconditional surrender for Japan. The Japanese were ready to negotiate an armistice with us much, much earlier than the actual end of the war, so long as it was not unconditional surrender. They needed to save face. But the Soviet agents of influence in the Roosevelt administration pushed for unconditional surrender, and in order to buy time, to prolong the war, to buy time so that Stalin would be able to maneuver his way into a position where he could exploit the situation in East Asia geostrategically and take over certain territories there and so on. Since that policy of unconditional surrender ended up prevailing in the Roosevelt administration, the Japanese were ready to fight to the last man. And that meant that we either had to invade the Japanese homeland or drop the bomb. We would have never had to drop the bomb if it hadn't been for Soviet agents of influence in the Roosevelt administration. And so this is related to the subject of deception because agents of influence are able to disguise themselves, and unless we have good counterintelligence, we're going to be vulnerable to all of the ill effects. And so, counterintelligence is one of the most important arts of statecraft. And when I founded IWP in 1990, having witnessed the weakness of our counterintelligence capabilities in numerous agencies in our government, I would venture to say that at that time, about 95% of intelligence officers, just regular intelligence officers, had never studied intelligence formally. And about 100% of counterintelligence officers had never studied counterintelligence formally. And there's a lot to study. There's the history, there are the epistemological issues. Epistemology means the theory of knowledge. How do you know something is true or not? What about propaganda and deception and disinformation, active measures, and all of that? If you don't know how these things work, how do you know that you are perceiving foreign reality correctly? And Reagan was more serious about improving our counterintelligence than any other recent president. The problem is that most counterintelligence, most people equate it with counterespionage. They only think about spies. But the problem is that counterespionage is only one aspect of counterintelligence. There is counter-deception, there is counter-active measures, and there is the larger question of offensive counterintelligence, which means the penetration of foreign intelligence services and working to disable them so that their operations in the United States are not nearly as effective as they otherwise might be. The problem, however, is that when the Cold War ended, we let our guard down. We thought, well, the Wicked Witch is dead. We don't have to worry about this anymore. We went on what I call a 10-year-long national siesta concerning matters of war and peace. And even though the radical jihadists tried blowing up the World Trade Center, during the 90s, it wasn't until 9/11 that we finally woke up from our slumbers. But then we took 3/4 of our counterintelligence officers and we shifted them into counterterrorism. And we did not backfill those counterintelligence positions, and we became ever more vulnerable to Chinese deception, Russian deception, and the ill effects that these have. And I mentioned these different impediments to seeing foreign reality correctly. I mentioned mirror imaging. Deception is one of them. But then there's wishful thinking. There's willful blindness, where people, the great Russian author Alexander Solzhenitsyn called this the desire not to know. Because if you know, then maybe you have a moral or a strategic obligation to do something about it. George Orwell called it the will to disbelieve the horrible. It's an ostrich-like behavior where you refuse to see reality as it really is. And this is not simply an intellectual problem. because there are many intellectual problems involved in all of this. This is a moral problem where, where people are willfully blind. And it's extremely difficult given the tendencies for groupthink, for accepting a conventional wisdom in different government agencies. Each agency has its sort of party line and conformity, and it's sometimes very hard to have open intellectual arguments in some intelligence agencies because the sort of the established view of it is has been set, and deception, and sometimes that established view is based on deception. There are many ways that people can be deceived. Foreign intelligence services can deceive us with, using exchanges, as I described. They can put false information into our intelligence channels. They can turn some of their defectors who defect to the United States may turn out to be double agents who are working for the bad guys already, but seeming to work for us. But then, there is you have people. One of the other channels of deception is where a foreign intelligence service will try to deceive our think tanks and our academic world. And what happens there is that if the professoriate and the think tank experts have been deceived, then their younger protégés receive the false or misleading information. The Chinese are very good at this. The Soviets did this masterfully. If you wrote the truth about the Soviet Union in a way that really made the Kremlin mad, they would deny you a visa to come to the country. They would deny you access to anything that might be helpful to you in your research. The Chinese do the same thing. They have established what I call the 4 taboos. What are those? Well, if you are a China expert in the United States and you write about their human rights violations, if you write about the Lao Gai, what's the Lao Gai? How come nobody knows what it is? It is the Chinese Gulag archipelago, their system of slave labor camps, and so on. But nobody knows what it is because nobody writes about it. And that's one taboo, human rights violations. How many people know about Chinese forced organ transplants, where you can, here we have 5,000 liver transplants in the United States every year, and you only get a liver if you just happen to be at the top of the waiting list and somebody gets killed in an auto accident but their liver is still in good enough shape to be transplanted. In China, you can establish a date certain for when you will get your liver, because you'll set the appointment and they will kill somebody in the Lao Gai, a Falun Gong practitioner, a Christian, a political dissident, somebody whom they don't like. They'll kill him for their organ. And there's only one country in the world, to my knowledge, that forbids its citizens from going to China for this type of medical tourism. And that's Israel. Israel has forbidden its citizens to go and get an appointment for an organ transplant where somebody's going to get killed for you to get that organ. We should have something like that in this country. God bless Israel for doing this. And so human rights violations, don't talk about them. The second taboo, don't talk about the Chinese military buildup. The third taboo, don't talk about Chinese espionage, which is rampant, and don't talk about Chinese political influence operations, deception, and so on and so forth. So how about espionage? We have an alumnus doing counterintelligence in Silicon Valley, and he reports that there are probably around 25,000 Chinese spies in Silicon Valley alone. Okay? 25,000 in Silicon Valley alone. And that doesn't, and every single one of the 375,000 Chinese students in American universities is by law beholden to the Chinese intelligence services to report on stuff that they demand of them. And Chinese businesses that do joint ventures with American companies are all beholden to reporting to the Chinese intelligence services. The Chinese are collecting data on everybody. TikTok is an instrument of Chinese intelligence. The Ancestry DNA, a couple of these companies, you send in a piece of your hair and your DNA, they are collecting it on Americans so that they can develop databases, social credit scores, and all of that on Americans. So you write about the four taboos, and you diminish your chances of getting a visa to go to China. They might threaten you, as they have threatened a number of China experts here. They will interfere with you. They'll hack your computer system. They shut down the entire computer system of the Naval War College in Newport because of the analysis that a couple of their scholars were doing there on China. So the four taboos. So if the scholars don't write about these things, and the scholars during the Cold War, many Sovietologists did not write about these things. And so their graduate students learn about this, and there are these entire fields that relate to our overall national security posture that are not covered by our experts because of this game that the Soviets and now the Chinese are playing. So this harms our ability to deal with reality as it really is. There was if I recall correctly, the Indonesian example, there are a couple of them. One was a forgery, and the other one had to do with counter-radicalization. And I think I may have mentioned that. Both of these are very interesting examples. Yeah, I can't remember which one of these things I raised. I know I raised one Indonesian example. Okay, well that example was a Soviet forgery, where the Soviets forged a letter from a senior general in the Pentagon to the U.S. ambassador in Indonesia. And it indicated plans for U.S. military intervention or some kind of manipulations of the political interference in the political system of Indonesia. This forgery was leaked to the Indonesian press as if the Russians had discovered some kind of a genuine Pentagon letter. The press reported it as genuine, And the president of Indonesia, I can't remember whether it was Sukarno or Suharto, then read this and went on a 2-week-long anti-American rampage. He was completely denouncing the United States every day for 2 weeks for interference in Indonesian political affairs. And we tried calling him up to tell him that this is all false and that this letter that he saw was a forgery. Nobody answered the phone in the president's office. Finally, we managed to get access to him, and we proved forensically to him that this was a Soviet forgery, that it was all a lie. And so he stopped his denunciations, but then, as a former cabinet member, I think he was a labor secretary who was accused of some scandal here and was proved innocent, he said, "Where do I go now to get my reputation back?" And so did he go on a 2-week corrective campaign to exonerate the United States and to denounce the Soviets for having done this deception? No, he didn't. The damage to America's reputation was done. So that is a classic active measure. And by the way, when we would think about the KGB during the Cold War, we would think of them as spies. And of course, as the internal Gestapo-like secret police inside the Soviet Union. But if you get the testimony of some of their most senior retirees, they have said that active measures were the heart and soul of the KGB. Active measures, much less than espionage. And because they have such an incredibly powerful strategic effect.
You have shown us how important your organization, the Institute of World Politics, is. How do people get in touch with you? Because this is amazing. I know we have a slide we're going to put up. Would you like them to email you at info@iwp.edu?
Yes, we are an independent graduate school. We are separate from any other university. We have our own independent accreditation. We have 7 master's degree programs. 2 of them have recently been launched. They are online programs. And we have, by the way, one of those is the first master's degree program in strategic intelligence in any university outside the U.S. government. And we have the first professional doctoral program in national security in the nation. And we just graduated. It's been in place for about 3 or 4 years. We're 32 years old, but the doctoral program is now only about 4 years old, and we just graduated our first 4 graduates. We are really interested in recruiting students who want to study some of the rare and neglected arts of statecraft. We specialize in teaching every one of these. The arts of statecraft are the instruments of national power. Military, traditional diplomacy, public diplomacy, cultural diplomacy, intelligence, counterintelligence, the many, many aspects of economic strategy, law enforcement, political warfare, ideological warfare, psychological strategy. These are some of the non-military instruments of conflict, and our theory is that it is better to use the non-military instruments of power, which will minimize the necessity of having to use force to defend our country and our allies.
John, you mentioned that public diplomacy is so important with people. Why is that?
It's very difficult to say, because I think leadership, it's strategic leadership is probably it, and the ability to use all of these individual tools, because you can have all of the armed, all the arms that you want. You can have all the military and economic capabilities, but if you don't have good leadership, if you don't have, high morale, for example, of the people who understand, the American people will understand what needs to be done in the world if it is explained to them. And leadership involves telling the American people the truth. And if you don't tell the people the truth, then all kinds of illusions can proliferate. And so we not only teach these arts of statecraft, we teach how they should be integrated and the importance of strategic leadership. And so we really need to have bright, motivated students who want to serve a cause higher than themselves.
Thank you, John. This was outstanding, and it shows us how important the Institute of World Politics is. And for more information, you can contact the IWP at info@iwp.edu. Join us next time as we bring you another exciting show by connecting people and developing the building blocks of relationships. We focus on world economic growth solutions, pressing health challenges, and promoting peaceful world societies. Remember to connect with peace, happiness, joy, and love. Bye for now.